Thank you for the intro. Cool. So, as they mentioned, I'm Ben. The title of my hack here is the Impossible Hack, but it's really sort of a meandering talk with kind of three main themes. The first being fun ideas and how to come up with them. The second being cobbling things together and kind of making them work under short time crunches. And then lastly, I want to talk about some things that I learned from doing this sort of repeatedly while I was in college and kind of how I brought them with me into industry afterwards. So before I get started in all of that, I wanted to put a big disclaimer that none of these are universal truths. These are sort of things that worked for me based on the series of goals that I had and kind of what I was trying to get out of the experience. So putting them all on the table, explicit non-goals for me. I never really hacked to learn a specific new technology. I never really wanted to build anything useful to people. I figured there was enough time when people were paying me to work and build useful things that I could do that I wouldn't do it in my free time. And I was never really trying to win. So if you're looking at kind of for how to win a hackathon guide, probably the wrong place. The goals for me were, as you can see below, I wanted to learn new ways to solve problems. I kind of always liked problem solving, and doing that in any capacity is fun to me. I wanted to play with fun toys. Hackathons had fun toys. People that came there have fun toys, both hardware, software, and ideas, and I like that. I liked having a space-time focused on creation. Nothing I did was sort of exclusive to where I was doing it, but times where you have 24 or 36 hours in a row to work on something, and people around you who are ambitious and helping you are pretty rare. And then lastly, MLH is a great crew, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that hanging out with them was a good part of it. So again, this is some observations based on what I was trying to achieve for myself. But feel free to tune and tweak them based on what you're looking to get. So who am I? I have kind of a couple of bio slides here. Some things I like, which I think guide how I work and what I work on, and some things I dislike. So like everyone here, I probably like taking things apart, breaking them, and rebuilding them more than the average person. I just like tinkering and seeing how things work. I really like making more with less. I think it's interesting to try and solve problems with sort of unique constraints. Hackathons being a certain set of constraints. You've got time constraints and budget constraints, but I think it's interesting to impose all kinds of constraints on yourself and see where you go. I like analyzing things, even sort of non-technical, non-data things with gory amounts of detail and using data. Nowadays I channel that into figuring out how to ride my bike better, how to brew beer better, but I really do that across a lot of things. I like borrowing tools. I mean this in the literal sense of I like playing with cool gizmos and gadgets and borrowing them from a friend, but also in a little bit more of an abstract sense of I like taking things and ideas that were purposed for one thing and applying them else. I also like trying things, and with trying things comes failing things. And as I'll talk about in a bit, pulling off technically ambitious things, there's a ton of failure involved, and there's ways to sort of channel that for success, and there's ways to sort of have that be demoralizing. And I'll chat a little about kind of channeling failure for positivity. Some things I dislike are kind of equally important, I think. Things that drive me nuts are repetition. If I have to do something more than twice, my mind kind of immediately goes to how can I automate that, and that inspires a lot of what I work on. I dislike things in the abstract. I much prefer getting my hands dirty and playing with something as opposed to learning the theory behind it. And I also I also hate being told that I'm not going to be able to do something. Spite maybe is more of a motivating factor for me than it should be, but I like trying something and failing it as opposed to setting the failure before I start. So a little more concretely, here's a bunch of pictures of me from when I was going to hackathons, which was my last 3 years of college. These are some favorites slash some proud moments of mine. My first place medal I'm very proud of. Meeting Donald Glover / Childish Gambino at a hackathon was also a pretty cool moment. Generally meeting a bunch of cool people and kind of nerding out over them was a real highlight of my college experience. I put this together. Here's a map of places that I went to hackathons. I'm sure I'm forgetting at least a couple, but I had kept this kind of running list somewhere, so I turned into a map, and it was sort of fun to see. Sort of the weird observation is that if you plot two lines, you've got the Northeast corridor, and then the sort of Detroit to Montreal route. You can encapsulate a lot of these. But I think my summary here is that I went to college in Rochester, but spent a lot of time not in Rochester, sort of working on some things. Here's who I am nowadays. I currently work at a company called Kensho in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My one shameless plug throughout this is we love interns and I love hiring hackers. So if any of you are interested, reach out. Currently, sort of in my technical life, I spend my day thinking about knowledge graphs. I spent probably 3-ish years building a knowledge graph on some pretty cool data. Distributed data processing is what I do nowadays, how we can put large volumes of data through sort of small pipes, if you will. And I currently manage people and really enjoy spending time not only trying to optimize myself, but optimize my team. Outside of work, I travel a lot, although not recently the past few months. I still consider myself very much of a hacker, but I look at things in a bit of a different sense of the world now. And I say that because most of what I consider hacking, I don't actually work with technology a whole lot anymore. I still write a lot of code, both inside and outside of work, but I like getting my hands dirty with woodworking and cooking and sort of hacking on things in non-traditional ways. When I'm not doing the above things, my main hobbies are cooking and brewing beer, just building things and using my hands. I've been riding my bike a lot lately, and when the weather's bad or when it's dark and when I'm out of other things to do, I'm sort of a sucker for bad TV. So what's this talk about? Bit of an outline. As I mentioned earlier, there's kind of 3 main things I want to cover. One is generating cool ideas. Again, there's no good how-to guide for generating a winning or interesting or a money-making idea, but I have some tips and tricks. The middle bit is going to be kind of about pulling things off. This is going to be a little bit scoped to the extent of pulling this off during a hackathon, but certainly not, certainly applicable lessons to many different things. And then lastly, I want to chat a little bit about taking the mindset that I got from being involved with hackathons and being involved with MLH, and how that has served me, kind of beyond going to college or collegiate hackathons. So starting off, my slides cooperate. Sorry, cool. Some things that the talk is not about. Again, it's not about winning things. It's not about impressing anyone. I think my favorite hacks are the things that other people find really boring. It's nice when there's an intersection between things that other people find cool and things that I find cool, but that's not what it was really about for me. And then lastly, I don't really want to cover learning any specific technology or anything like that. That one slide, maybe another twice. Cool. So generating ideas. Here's a brief overview of how I generated ideas, and I'll break these down a little bit further in just a bit. So I put a couple of bullets in this talk in red. I think these are some of the more important points, so I'll dwell on them a little bit more. So one of the things that kind of surprises people is I never generated ideas that I thought I could do. To me, it was always fun. If I knew how to do it, it wasn't especially interesting. As I mentioned earlier, I hate repetition, so I don't like building things that I've already built, and I don't really like solving problems I've already solved. So I think part of it is kind of framing it, and when you're not framing this to win anything or to impress anyone, you can really channel this into like a, hey, I'm going to fail a lot of the time. Even if I fail, I can pivot, but I'm still going to have fun and learn a lot if I fail. And in fact, I've probably learned more from projects that I failed on and learning why that I failed than I've learned in projects that I've succeeded on. But generating, realistic ideas is obviously pretty useful too. There's a certain satisfaction to finishing something, even if it is in sort of a demoable state, but not a final state. So that said, the 5 big themes in how I think of ideas and how I find projects to work on are as follows. My largest source was always basically stealing good ideas that other people had. I say this sort of tongue-in-cheek, not in an endorsing plagiarism kind of way, but in a sort of endorsing the scientific process kind of way. Lots of scientific papers is really just knowledge propagating from one field to another. So, people think a lot of this is sort of things going from the quote unquote pure fields like statistics into the applied fields, if you will, like social science and things like that. But that's not always the case. Good fields are happening, or sorry, good ideas are happening in all kinds of fields. And like really, if you look at papers either across fields or within fields, a lot of them are just applying others' ideas to new data and just new outcomes. So a lot of the way I think about things is what are good ideas that other people had that haven't been applied to the problem that I'm trying to solve yet. And even if you don't have your own problem, two other good ideas that haven't been combined yet on a studied problem often lead some pretty interesting results, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Problems that I have is sort of an obvious one, but I wanted to chat about it anyways. I mentioned that I like solving my own problems. I like automating myself out of things. I like learning about the things I do better. The problems you are most equipped to, or best equipped to solve are the ones that you have. So I often look to annoyances in my life or things that I wish existed to for inspiration on problems. So I think like there's a lot of focus on, especially in the corporate world, on like, oh, you have to build things that are useful to other people or things that make money, et cetera. But working with myself, my goal is not to make money. My goal is not to make things useful for other people. It was sort of have fun and build things that are useful to me. The third is my favorite bullet, useless things that are fun. I think it's okay to build things that have absolutely no use to anyone, including yourself. Sometimes you just want to mess around, and there's nothing wrong with a useless project that was fun to build or you learned something. The last two are, one, I think that data is the mother of invention. It might be that necessity a little bit. If someone has bothered to collect data on something, that means that data is probably pretty useful. So just looking at interesting data sets and using, letting the sort of data drive the question as opposed to the question drive the data, is something I look at when I'm looking for inspiration. Again, if it's collected and usable and you can find a new way to solve a problem with that, you'll come up with sort of a really powerful idea. I'm going to touch on the term technical arbitrage here. I'm going to go into that a whole lot more later, but I think that knowing kind of where data is and how to use it is one of the best advantages that you can have as far as pulling something off. And again, I'm going to jump into that a little bit later. And then lastly, I like building things that other people have built with my own constraint. I don't think it's, I don't personally find it super interesting to try and recreate something exactly. I'm not going to spend the next 10 years of my life trying to recreate Facebook because that's, not what I'm looking to do. But I think like applying or looking at how someone else has solved the problem and then taking away one of the things or many of the things that they had and trying to solve it yourself with a different constraint, be it time, money, budget, compute power, people, data, etc. I think is a lot of fun and leads to sort of a lot of interesting ideas. And if someone has 10 times the resources than you, and you solve it 20% as well as they did, you kind of win there. You did it better than them, even if your end product is worse than that. So I think it's a very discouraging mentality to say, hey, this thing I built is not really useful or it's not as good as X, because you did it with your own constraints, and the constraints with which you built this might make it more impressive, better, or cooler than someone else. So breaking these down in a little bit more detail. For some of these, I base this on some hacks that I worked on at hackathons. So as I mentioned earlier, idea transfer is the idea of stealing someone else's work on sort of the hard part and applying it on the easy part. So especially in the context of a hackathon or even something like a summer internship, you're never going to come up with something, or you're unlikely to come up with something totally groundbreaking. Most of the really good ideas in this world or not eureka moments. They're things that people spent months and years and teams and money and time building up to. So it's unlikely that you're going to kind of create the next neural network or make the next Facebook at a hackathon, and that's okay. What you can do is take good ideas that other people have had and try them out in new areas. So two ones that I built here that I'm proud of and I want to chat about. One I called speech to scene. This was basically throwing some pretty standard natural language processing, which was always, always has a soft spot in my heart, and throwing that into the space of VR. So the way it worked is you would say something out loud, something along the lines of, there's a small computer on a table, the table is red, and then that scene would come to life around you based on sort of the interpretation of your words. Did we build anything especially novel for that? No. People have been working on figuring out intent in speech for certainly longer than I've been alive. People have made VR games for a very long time, much more successfully than we did. But we built this sort of cool experience in combining them and saying, like, it was cool to have this world that you describe sort of come to life around you, and ended up being a pretty nifty final project. And then another one you can see on the right. I'm not sure the MLH people have forgiven me for making them procure a projector on basically no notice. We made this sort of very, very janky smart whiteboard where, again, people have been using projectors to teach math for a long time. People have been recognizing handwriting for a long time, and people have been working on equation solving for a long time. We had a lot of fun. We put it together into this whiteboard where you drew on it and it would sort of solve the math questions you're writing for you. Again, the people at Smart Company have been working on smartboards for a very long time. They were probably doing it with a little bit more time and a lot more budget and a lot more advanced hardware than the pieces of cardboard that we cobbled together. So this one sort of combines taking some existing technologies and some extra constraints. The last bullet I have here is I personally always tried to avoid what I thought of as the API chain hack. So when I think of that, I think of like, okay, I found cool APIs. All I'm going to do is sort of string them together. But I like the mentality of sort of chaining technologies together. I think it's interesting to sort of build the technology for yourself as opposed to relying on others. But the mentality of like taking somewhat established ideas and figuring out the glue between them, I think is pretty powerful. So next up, some problems I've got. Here are some 3 more hacks. The one on the right might be my favorite hack of all time. This is a zip line from my college apartment to the dumpster across the street. I went to college in upstate New York. It was cold. We didn't like going outside to take out our trash. We tried to build a zip line to the dumpster. This is not something I'll recommend. Most people don't have dumpsters off their patio, and this solution helped me and exclusively me. But I had a lot of fun with this, and it was very satisfying to build something that really scratched an itch of mine that I was having. Slightly more practically, in the bottom left is an offline version of Wikipedia. I decided, I was doing a lot of travel. I spent a lot of time on airplanes. It drove me nuts not being able to look things up online while I was in an airplane. So I built this, I think it ended up being like 50 megabyte little compressed version of Wikipedia that I could just cache on my computer, and I had access to sort of some basic search tools, some basic Wikipedia functionality. Again, maybe it's useful to other people, but it was built out of a frustration of mine, which means that I understood the problem really well. So a hard thing about working on other people's ideas is understanding their problem is really difficult. When you're working on something that is inspired by something you need, you sort of inherently understand the problem really well. And then lastly, I cook a lot. I sometimes lack inspiration on what to cook. So I built myself a little app that takes into account the season, the weather, some vague notions of what I'm in the mood for, and built me a recipe recommendation system. Again, maybe useful for other people, but I understood what I wanted to get out of it, and that made it sort of really easy for me to build. Useless fun. Another one of my favorite hacks, and I'll play a video. We built a very crappy weather, meteorological display thing. So we wanted to play newscasters, and I never got to stand in front of a real green screen. So we made this really crappy Connect version of playing weather person. Is this useful to anybody? No, the news stations all have much higher budgets and all that, but this falls under my category of useless fun. Other things that useless fun. We made a cool Spider-Man VR game. I always wanted to fly around the city like Spider-Man when I was a kid, so I made it happen. Again, I want to stretch my theme of like none of this did anything for anybody, but it was a lot of fun to build and certainly learned a lot along the way. Data was my fourth one. This is actually something I worked on just a couple of months ago, but I found this really cool data set of beer reviews. So I'm a beer nerd. That's one of the things that is a very tangible experience, but I still love to look at from a data perspective. So I found this really cool data set of beer reviews, and I did a bunch of natural language processing on just trying to figure out like what aspects people of like a beer drinking experience people talk about, how you can use that to sort of learn about what they're drinking. The top is the data, the bottom is sort of one of the cool visualizations where we're able to like plot this very fluid, if you'll excuse the pun, thing of like drinking a beer. We're able to plot that on a graph, which to me is super cool, and I love to nerd out about this kind of thing. But it was again totally inspired by I have this data. What can I do with it? And again, a theme you'll see is I'm really passionate about hacking on things that mean a lot to me and that I care a lot about. I think it makes you better at it, and I think it makes it much more satisfying. So here's an example of something sort of data-driven, but also something that's sort of near and dear to my heart. And then lastly, rebuilding other ideas with other people's constraints. These are all projects that I worked on that the idea I had is nothing new, but the implementation of it was sort of unique. The bottom right, I think, is my absolute favorite. I got to do my last collegiate hackathon was the first time my college hosted one. So I figured we'd pull out all the stops and see if we can make my car drive itself. I generally didn't have a car or access to any of the labs or friends with dorm rooms full of electronics parts. So I figured I'd take advantage of the opportunity and see what we could cobble together in a weekend. Again, am I competing with the Teslas of the world and the self-driving cars of the world? Absolutely not. Would I trust what we made on a real road for more than 30 feet with me behind the wheel? No, not in the slightest, but it was this sort of like when I changed the constraint, how far can you get? And the top right is another one of my favorites. I built a MapReduce framework on top of DigitalOcean. So MapReduce is a pretty well-studied technology. Google's been doing it for a long time. But I took a platform that was, at the time at least, a lot simpler. Something that didn't support auto scaling of machines, something that didn't support a lot of like talking between machines, and just saw how much kind of technical infrastructure I could build on top of that. So the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of generating ideas is, this is sort of goes on my most important takeaways list for this talk, is the idea of sort of personal and technical arbitrage. This is an idea, I'm sure others have come up with it by another name. Technical arbitrage is sort of my name for it, but it's really one of my guiding principles in everything that I take on and work on. So it's a take on sort of specialization, which is that, there are things that I'm better at, then there are things that you're better at, and that's good for society. If I stick to the things that I'm good at and you stick to the things you're good at, we can make a net more results than if we both try and do the things that we're good at and the things that we're bad at. And it's sort of a direct rebuttal to the, well, it's too challenging, in the sense that what's too challenging for you is not too challenging for me, and what's too challenging for me is not too challenging for you. So my secret here, and I guess I can reveal this after a long time of being in retirement, is that like I never really worked on anything that felt super hard. I worked on things that were in my wheelhouse and easy for me. And sometimes I got lucky and they seemed hard for other people, but there's a whole host of things that are absolutely impossible to me that other people do day in and day out in their sleep. So the idea of technical arbitrage is basically you have an advantage in doing what you're good at. So when I think of things, when at work, when I think of like what projects my team can take on, I don't think of this from like do we have capacity for this, but I think of it as like, are we the right people? Because are we better at it than somebody else? you'll note here that I have a long list of things, ways that you can be better at something than other people. None of them are being smart. This is not a question of anyone being smarter or less smart or like having the ability to do something that others can't. But instead, they're sort of ways to eke yourself out an advantage based on other factors. So the top one of these is always domain knowledge. I studied natural language processing in school, which is at the time is something that not a lot of people know about. So I could put together what were somewhat standard NLP techniques in a way that sort of looked impressive to a lot of people. But again, these were things that I had just studied more than them, not kind of knew anymore or any better. Data is a great way to get some arbitrage to get an advantage. If I have a data set that answers questions that you don't, the questions that I can answer are going to seem like magic to you. One of my favorite sayings is, it's not magic, it's just data. But like really, you can do a lot of things that other people can't if you have data that they can't. I think I put this quote later in the talk too, but it's important, so I'll say it twice. Data, especially that isn't accessible, doesn't exist. Just knowing how to get at your data in a way that others can't, again, makes you be able to do things that they can't. Sometimes the answer is you have the right gadget. Without a VR headset that other people have spent thousands of hours developing, I can't make a VR hack. But if I have a VR headset, I can make a better VR hack than you who doesn't. So sometimes you just have access to the right tools, either hardware or software. Sometimes there's some foolish optimism. Sometimes there's like, hey, I'm stupid enough to think that I can pull this off. These often led to the failure bucket, but sometimes the answer is just I think I can do it, so I'm going to try it. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, interest in a topic. You being passionate about something is just going to make you more productive. At least personally, my brain just shuts off when I'm not interested in something, but I can't turn it off when there's something I'm interested in. So hacking on things that are in my like little bubble of things I like to nerd out about just makes me better at hacking about them because I'm inherently interested. And in the real world, most of these are a combination of the three. But my takeaway quote for this slide and for technical arbitrage in general is, my impossible hack is your weekend project, and vice versa. So think about like not what can be done, but think about like what you can do based on your unique skill set. And if you surround yourself with people with complementary skills in this mindset, not only can you build anything, which is sort of the cheesy line here, but the sort of interesting takeaway is that you never have to build anything hard. If you figure out what's easy for you and surround yourself with people who build what's easy for them and they're complementary, you get to spend your whole life working on the easy stuff and the fun stuff, which is a great combination of things to work on. So before I talk about executing these ideas, I've been yapping for about a half hour. Are there questions or comments on that? Okay, I'll keep going. So I'm executing some of these ideas. So I have this into 4 categories. The first is pre-work. Pre-work does not mean starting things. Pre-work means getting yourself up to start things. Basically, anything you do is going to have some level of, frankly, crap that you have to do. Setting up environments, downloading drivers, unpackaging the thing. The more of that you can do ahead of time, the better. These things just take a lot of time. Just get everything set up ahead of time. It's no fun if you start anything ahead of time, but you can certainly get rid of the boring parts, and the boring parts tend to be the tedious parts. Strictly logistically, these are great things to do on buses on the way to a hackathon when you're bored anyways. I spent many a bus and airplane ride just setting up dev environments because I knew I was going to have to do it. May as well get it out of the way. Technical minimalism is something I'm going to chat about a lot, but it's the idea of taking only the interesting bit and then figuring out the minimal amount of things that you can do to support that. The other 2 big ones are finding the right team. Complementary skills are better than great skills. I would rather have a mediocre person who can do what I can't than the best person to do what I can. You want to find people that work well with you, not people that argue, and make sure these people also have the right attitude. And I say right attitude, not that there's sort of many wrong attitudes, but I always try to surround myself with people who had similar expectations and similar goals to myself. If I'm hacking in something because I want it, and you're hacking in something because you want to win a laptop, that's inherently going to be sort of a different set of priorities. Neither of them are right or wrong, but if they don't align, there might be some friction. And then lastly, focus and focusing on the right things. So technical minimalism. Here's a list of slides, and this might be an embarrassing list for some, but here's a list of things that I've never done at a hackathon, and I've actually never done most of them in sort of my real life. I've never made a logo, I've never bought a domain, I've never written a logon system to anything, I've never applied more style than Bootstrap, I've never finished everything I wanted to, I've probably never implemented something the optimal way. At a hackathon, at least, I've never written a unit test. And I've never even come close to building something maintainable. And for some people, these might be sort of, not things they're proud of. Like, oh man, like I was too lazy, I never built a logo if this is not done. But I sort of wear these like a badge of honor, in the sense of these are things that are useful in sort of the real world of building software, but they don't actually help you build your idea or build anything more useful. So, when you're trying to build an idea or sell a product to 1 million people, you need a domain, you need a fancy logo, but spending time to buy a domain, register that with AWS, write a logon system that checks people's passwords, unless your hack is directly related to one of those things, none of them really help out in the core idea of your hack. So my biggest advice to people was always to figure out, again, what is the core thing you're trying to build, and what is the absolute minimal set of things you need to show that off. So if you're building a website, you probably don't need a working logon system for the purpose of displaying what your website actually does. It's great that people can log on. It's great that you'll have security if you ever launch it, but check the username, put CFA equals admin. If yes, go to one page. If not, go to another. You're probably all right. And these are going to let you focus on the many more important things. Next up, really iron out the team you're working with and the sequencing of things as soon as you can. I want to draw a distinction between dividing responsibilities and sort of like the dividing up how things should work and making API contracts, because one of them is super important. One of them is something you should avoid. So something you should do is divide responsibilities ASAP. Repeated work is worse than no work at all. Repeated work both is not any more useful than one person doing it, but also exhausts people. If one person does it and the other doesn't, at least the second person can rest. So really make sure that you know who's doing what, and you know like roughly what the expectations are. That said, at this stage of things, I'm really against like having any or making any kind of hard restrictions on that. So like anything like an API contract, I find overkill. Which brings me to my next point of like, do everything just in time. Do not spend time making an API contract, because chances that your service is going to do what you think it does 8 hours from now is pretty low. So a lot of the planning that you can do, it's possible that's sort of not at all needed. So when I say do everything just in time, what I mean is, hey, I finished this thing and here's what it ended up looking like. You finished the other thing, here's what it ended up looking like. Now that these things have to talk to each other, let's figure out how they should do that. API contracts and stuff like that are really nice in the real world when you can properly plan things, but in a world where everything is evolving all at once, really do everything right when you need it, because there's a good chance that you won't actually need it if you don't. Another sort of guiding principle I always tried for was validate your core idea by the halfway mark. It really stinks when the core part of your thing doesn't work at the end and everything else does, because that's about as useful as nothing working. So I always try to sort of not finish, but validate the hard part, if you will, by the midway point. And it's, for me at least, it was always better to pivot into something else less interesting, less ambitious, than to kind of not finish anything and not get anywhere. And then lastly, I think this was always a really important one to me. I always try to work with people who left their egos in their dorm rooms, if you will. There's just going to be frustration, stupid mistakes, failure. And I like working with people who are, don't try for those things, but are okay when they happen. So it's a little bit about how I sort of organized the work I did and organized the people I worked with. And as I mentioned earlier, like the most important thing to me was having these complementary skill sets and having the right attitude. The last last slide on this bit is about focus. To me, focus means working smart as opposed to working hard. Making sure that we're working on the right things, and this goes hand to hand with sort of the minimalism. But again, like trying to balance the right things with everything else. Again, as I said a slide ago, the wrong thing is worse than building nothing. You can at least rest while you do nothing. So checking in on myself, checking in on my teammates, and kind of managing all of that was always super important. Focus did not mean, though, that if this is a 24-hour event, I need to be staring at my screen for 24 hours. Sleep, walk around, have fun. They're probably going to make things better, actually. One good working hour is way better than 4 or 5 or 6 multiple bad ones. So if you're asleep, if you're falling asleep, go to sleep. Don't try and work through it. The code you write when you wake up will be much better. You can ask the MLH guys of sort of proof of this, but basically every 2 hours, almost regardless of what I was doing, I would get up and do what I sort of thought of as an inspiration lap. It's just like walk in a circle, ask 3 people what they're working on, tell them what I'm working on, have a little bit of a chat, and then I would always come back like super refreshed and like be really inspired because like they gave me an idea based on what I had. I would say, hey, this other team's building really cool stuff. Again, focus means writing code at the right times and doing it correctly, as opposed to only writing code and only doing that. And then lastly, ask for help on stupid mistakes. This is something that actually took me a pretty long time in my career to sort of internalize, but like small mistakes happen to everyone. If you can drop your ego and ask people help fixing them, you're going to fix, like a second pair of eyes is just going to fix it so much more quickly and more easily than you looking at yourself. So like, even if the answer is, well, I should really be able to fix this thing, like, let me just browse Stack Overflow, like ask people, 2 minds is almost always better than 1. Any questions on execution or comments or disagreements? Cool.
I would be, sorry, I'm going to chime in. I don't know if other people have questions, but I don't know if you're going to tackle this later, but I'm always curious, like, how these lessons do or don't translate to the real world as well.
Yep. I'm going to tackle that right now.
Oh, great.
Cool. So I call this lesson learned, moving on and up, in the sense of like, here's how these things, as John nicely segued for me, how these did impact my real life. So here's a long list of things that I brought into the real world that I got from hackathons. So one, being able to swan dive into messy problems is a huge leg up. I say swan dive because there's a difference between jumping in and jumping in gracefully. It was great in school to learn about sort of well-formed problems and how to solve them. When an algorithm's problem looks like this, use X. Things in the real world very, very, very infrequently have clean solutions like things in academia. Just too many moving parts. So, hacking is great for getting exposure to poorly formed problems, and again, with the sorts of constraints. So when you're looking at an academic problem, at least from the purpose of classes, it's a little bit less in research, but you're always going to have the tools, like, you'll know about the right tool you needed. If you're working on a dynamic programming question, you'll have learned dynamic programming in your class, you have the right tool. In the real world, the tools don't exist or you don't know about them. So figuring out how to get up to speed very quickly was super useful for me in moving into a job. Next is that finding and solving problems are orthogonal skill sets. The big software engineering professional lesson I have for all of you today is that you have to use the word orthogonal in basically every tech talk you do. I don't know why, but it seems to be an unsung industry rule. But what I mean by this bullet is that like identifying problems is totally different than solving them. A lot of people can do one. You'll give yourself a huge advantage if you can do both. So what this ends up looking like in industry is you've got what are referred to as the product people or the business people that are the ones finding problems, and then the engineering are the ones solving that. If you can be the bridge between them, or if you can sort of do aspects of both, that's going to be hugely beneficial to you. You know, there are great engineers everywhere, there are great product people everywhere, and I think it's very hard to find people who can do both. And if you can manage to kind of hone the skills of exactly doing what a hackathon is and finding a problem and executing it, that'll be a huge advantage. MVPs of everything is another core. I probably should have made this red. Going kind of hand in hand with technical minimalism, like validating things and figuring out how to validate ideas, implementations, products, etc. early is an incredibly powerful tool. There's just so much wasted effort that happens in the world building things that are not right or aren't what people need exactly. And the quicker you can learn to validate things, the better. This is everything from the product side of like, hey, does this thing my company is building, like, is this useful to people? Will they pay us money for it? To the implementation thing of like, hey, I've got this 5-day long messy coding problem. You know, can I figure out on day one how well I'm going to do and kind of where I need help? So I think of basically every task I'm given as first, let me do an MVP of it to make sure that I can do it, and then I'll sort of fill in the blanks around it. Next up, diversity is super important. Having clones of yourself is not any better than just having yourself, really. Hackathons definitely taught me the importance of surrounding myself with people with different both skills and backgrounds as me, because with those come one, they have their own technical arbitrages that on me that I don't, and two, they know problems you don't, and they have different perspectives on your problems. So I like myself a lot. I would hate to work with a clone of myself. It's probably the least useful person that I could ever work with. I alluded to this earlier, but I think this is especially true in the context of a hackathon. Of like anything that's hard to use may as well not exist. If you can't get started on something, find your data, install your software easily, it's doomed for failure. And this has been kind of a guiding principle as I work a lot with data. One of the biggest problems my team faces, or where we spend a lot of our time, is just on data discovery. Again, if people are not satisfied with the experience around using our stuff, they're just not going to. So these often aren't the sexy problems of like figuring out how to make things usable and friendly. But if you don't do that, you may as well not build anything. Next up, learning how to learn how to do things is better than knowing how to do things. This is a bit of a wordy way of saying like jump into problems a lot. And like, one of the things that I learned at hackathons was how to get myself up to speed about something that I knew nothing about very quickly. When you're going from, hey, I've never touched a VR headset in my life, to I'm trying to have an Oculus Rift game done 24 hours from now, you need to be very adept at reading tutorials and just figuring stuff out. And to me, that is always more important than like knowing how to do an individual thing. I really, even at this point in my life, I don't consider myself a subject matter expert on basically anything, but I really pride myself in figuring out how to do things pretty efficiently. Next up, scoping, parallelizing, cutting features, prioritizing, all things that you do all the time in a hackathon. You will become your project manager's best friend. I promise you, if you can say these words as an engineer. Just like thinking about what to include, what not to include, how to take a stream of work for one person and split it up among 3 people, how to cut features for an MVP, how to figure out what's most and least important to build. These are like tremendously helpful skills. Very practically, having a diversity of different things you've worked on your resume is super helpful. It's a really great conversation point when someone mentions, oh, I work in imaging, say, oh, I've done a computer vision project, blah, blah, blah. it's a really great way to sort of get your foot in the door a lot of places, even if you've only spent a day working on this thing. A couple more. One, winning is not everything. I was lucky enough to win or do well at a couple of hackathons, but there's basically no correlation between those hackathons and things I learned and ones that I failed on and what I learned. So like there's a tremendous benefit to just doing these things and trying these things and failing at them, even if you never go anywhere with it. The last two are a little bit lighthearted. Flexibility is everything. You just got to be willing to go with the wind in a lot of different areas. And then lastly, showering and sleeping are lovely things. I realize hackathons have come a long way since I was doing them in terms of access to showers and sleep rooms and all those things, but it really is nice when everyone is clean and well rested. So I like to put a little bit of a trick reveal in all of the presentations I give. So here's my little trick reveal here is I called this lessons I learned at a hackathon and brought into the real world. But the real title of this slide really should have been that things you need to work successfully at a startup. Basically, all of these things with some modifications are things that are incredibly helpful for getting a company off the ground in its early days. This is my personal experience. I haven't tried these at a big company or frankly in other places. I'm sure there are general purpose versions of all of these, but my personal experience, I went to a 25-ish person startup after school and found myself like really drawing on these skill sets very frequently as like, I could pick up exactly where I learned that skill set. And that was super helpful to me in kind of early days of our company, and really, I think, gave me a leg up on a lot of other people that I work with.
I was going to say too, Ben, this is Leah. About 10 minutes left, so just
perfect. Cool. So my summary slide is if you forget everything else here, I think my two most important bits. Thinking about technical arbitrage, why is it easier for me or the technology and tools that I have than anyone else? That's what's going to make you excel in the things that you do stand out. I think if all of us started the same thing that none of us knew about at the same time, I would like to think I would end up solidly in the middle of the pack as far as doing it. But there are things that I can do easily that you all can't, and there are things that you all can do easily that I can't. And then lastly, be super lazy, be a minimalist. You can call it being lazy if you want. Just figure out like what's the laziest way you can do it. Do everything right when you need to it. And focus on the hard parts. That's probably what's interesting. Anyways, leave the polish for later on. And I believe that is it. I don't like ending with a question slide, but I'll end with an ask me anything slide. I gave you some suggestions if you're not creative, but I'm happy to answer either anything about my hacking experience or kind of where I've gone since then. Also, thank you for coming and listening. I forgot to put that on the slide. Any questions?
Folks can post in chat if they prefer to.
I have not been looking at the chat the whole time. Let me stop sharing and find the chat. Cool. Why do I not like LinkedIn? That's a great question that I'm always very happy to answer. I sort of joke that, but it's not really a joke, that like my Facebook is my LinkedIn. I work a lot, if it wasn't clear, in like things that are really passionate about, that like I'm really passionate about and that are really important to me. So I don't like having a separation between like, here's my work things and my work friends, and here's my like fun things and my fun friends. I prefer them to be the same group of people. So like when I'm looking for a job, I'd much rather talk to the people in my circles that I know that I work well with and work in common things, as opposed to sort of connect in sort of a business environment. I'd much rather connect in within the domains that I like to exist in. So I don't like LinkedIn because I guess I don't like overly corporate things either, but I'd much rather connect sort of organically in the circles that I'm interested in, as opposed to kind of on a platform specifically built for that. So I think it approximates it not quite as well. I also think they have terrible privacy practices, but I won't get too much on my soapbox. Any other questions?
Can I say, is there kind of last call for questions?
If you don't feel like asking them now, I don't know if that gets distributed to people in the recording, but I put my email account in the chat. Say hi. I like to hear what people are working on. If you ever want to brag to someone about what you're working on, if you think it's cool, I'm always happy to listen. So if you ever want to brag about something or email me a question, there is my email, and feel free to distribute that to people on recording if the chat doesn't make it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you again for this amazing workshop, giving just a little bit of background on how to be innovative in the hacking world. So getting some great talks and some thanks in the chat right now. So that's awesome. Otherwise, thank you again. This will be posted so you guys can revisit as well.